Hello and welcome to the Matt's Movie Reviews podcast. I am your host, Matthew Pejkovic, and this is episode number 610. Releasing June 5 in Australia on DVD and digital is Delias Gone, a crime drama that stars Stephan James as Lewis, an intellectually disabled man wrongfully convicted for the murder of his sister Delia. After serving his time, Lewis pursues the truth as to who killed his sister on that fateful night years ago. A gripping murder mystery that also stars Marissa Tomei, Paul Walter Hauser, and Travis Fimmel. Delias Gone also marks the latest film from director Robert Budreau, who I'm glad to say joins me now on the podcast. Robert, how are you today?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. So after I watched Delias Gone, I did a bit of a deep dive because the music in the film was something that really kind of like just I don't know what it was. It just kind of spoke to me. And the one song that I first found was the Blind Willie McTell song of The Liar. That song in itself has such an interesting background. There's such a history behind it as well. And there's been many different variations of the song over the years. But what was it about that song in particular and that version by Blind Willie McTell that spoke to you that not only you had it in the film, and I'm just kind of curious, does that song have any inspiration whatsoever in the creation of the song? Because I know music's important to you, folk music especially, and I'm just curious whether that song, that story behind that song, has any type of influence over the creation of what we see in The Light Is Gone.
Definitely. I worked on the script is based on a short story and some earlier workings with my partner Michael Hamblin. And basically the early versions of the script were even more focused on kind of some of this folklore. And so Blind Willie McTell on that song, they introduced some of these characters, like there's famous folk characters, Stackerly,
Mm.
Billy Lyons. These are all kind of like characters out of folk mythology. And so I kind of came to Delia's Gone through my love of Bob Dylan. I'm a big Bob Dylan fan, and I've used some of Bob's work in my previous films. And Bob has a great version of Delia's Gone, and people are quite familiar with Johnny Cash's version of Delia's Gone. But I kind of partly through my love of Dylan, kind of went back and listened to a lot of the stuff from the 20s through the 40s, including Blind Willie McTell and others. Bob Dylan has a song called Blind Willie McTell as well. And so, and then obviously, the song itself is about the rape and murder of a, I think it's a 14-year-old
Yeah.
black. And so obviously our film isn't like an adaptation of that song, but it uses the core concept of violence and the rape and death of a young woman. And then it kind of mythologizes it and uses some of the names of some other folk characters. So it was kind of part of the genesis of it all, for sure. So I'm glad that you cut that.
Another song that is really central in the movie is Ring Those Golden Bells, or when they ring those golden bells. And there's again many different variations of that song as well that I found. The one that you used in your movie was from the Southern Sons. What was it about that song that you used almost kind of like a motif between the relationship between Delia and Lewis throughout the song? I mean, they play it on piano, they sing the song throughout the film. What was it about that song as well that really spoke to you and that you wanted to have it? It's kind of like almost a kind of focal kind of theme throughout the movie.
Well, I like the fact that it had a certain redemptive quality to it, and it kind of captures this kind of gospel redemptive quality. And for me, it was like, even though it's obviously quite a dark movie, um, I think part of Lewis's search for the truth, it is, there's a procedural aspect to it, but it's also a way to kind of finally free himself and liberate himself. And that song, which is done and been done many times, is kind of speaks to that kind of a feeling. And so, and I just particularly love that particular rendition that we used, which is just amazing vocally, that those guys can kind of create that music without any instrumentation. And so, and then when I decided that he would also have the piano, it kind of worked well in terms of, like you say, making it into a bit of a unified theme and a bit of a sweet note, and something that those two could have between themselves.
Um, Delia's Gone deals with a small town, and sometimes they say smaller the town, the bigger the secrets, right? And I know for yourself that you've been always been kind of fascinated with rural noirs or rural kind of thrillers. What was it about that genre of film that really you're a big? What is it about that genre of film and genre of storytelling that you're a big fan of that you wanted to delve into that yourself with this movie?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in a very small town in southwestern Ontario in Canada, town called Ingersoll, which has got about 8,000 people. It's kind of an agricultural town. I mean, I wasn't far from the cities, but so growing up, I think it went into my subconscious this idea of the countryside, and I've always then I think gravitated to some of the more rural noir, the more blue collar kind of rural noir, like the films of Jeff Nichols, and then even going back, some of my favorite historic noir. I mean, a lot of hardboiled noir is urban, but I've always gravitated to the more rural noir. And so, but then I realized that I hadn't actually done a film in that space. And so, when I was working with Michael Hamblin on this, it was really exciting because in some ways it was kind of bringing me back to a childhood aesthetic. And you always want to find ways to kind of personalize things in your work, even though it's there's nothing directly personal in this film for me, but I felt like the world, that small town rural noir, was certainly kind of came out of my childhood.
There's something about the film that it's set in modern day, but it almost feels like we're dealing with an analog world in a sort of way. I mean, people do have, their smartphones and such, but it's not to the point where it kind of dominates. And I think sometimes in thrillers these days, those kind of gadgets and stuff kind of dominate how the plot and like the way that people, communicate with one another. How, what was it about kind of created this kind of like almost analog world that really kind of that approach that you had towards a film that you didn't want to have kind of like modern tech things like social media or iPhones, so you didn't want that stuff to kind of dominate in any way and take away from the other aspects of the film. Excuse me, because excuse me, because to me, I thought it was really kind of cool how even though it is a modern day story, it kind of like felt like a older movie in a sort of way. Maybe it has to do with the characters, maybe it has to do with the setting. I'm not sure. I'm just really curious about that.
Yeah. Well, for whatever reason, I've always gravitated to period films, older music. I have a bit of an old soul that way, and I think of all my films, I mean, I've done Born to Be Blue as 50s, 60s, Stockholm was 70s. I just finished a film called Queen of Bones, which was 30s. This was actually the only contemporary film that I've done in the last batch, and so. But I think when I sat down with my production designer Zazu and kind of conceptualized it, it's a bit of a stereotype, but certainly small towns, whether it's small town Canada or middle America, they often do have they are often a little bit behind in technology, and I think for the better in a lot of ways. And I also find for storytelling, technology dates very fast, so it makes your film dated. It's easier to have a timeless film without, and it also makes a lot of the narrative tricky if you have too much technology. And so I was trying as much as possible to reduce that. And aesthetically, I think having like old trucks and like, you go to a lot of these old farmhouses in the country, and they are kind of like they're living in a bit of a retro past. And I think it's just being accurate. I think there's a scene where Marissa Tomei's character is quickly searching her phone. It's like one of the only times that you're kind of reminded of the contemporary kind of thing. And like you say, there's a few cell phone things, but it's all pretty minimal. And so that kind of gives it a throwback quality, which I kind of like. And there's that kind of mice and men, sling blade kind of, there's certainly some archetypes for this kind of a character. And to me, I associate those with something from the past, even though I think having someone like a Stefan James in the lead does obviously kind of freshen up that archetype, because the kind of the middle America crime drama archetype is pretty strong and people know what to expect. And so you also want to try to give it a bit of freshness.
Please support Matt's movie reviews on Patreon. Get access to exclusive content, request movie reviews and top 10 lists, and help support my work. Please click on the Patreon link in the description below. The film is set in Ohio, or like Middle America. It's filmed in Canada though, but I kind of feel like there's sort of kind of like a Southern coffee kind of elements to it as well. Some moments I found kind of scary in a certain way. There's a scene where Lois comes across this blind woman who kind of fancies herself to be like a palm reader. And that scene in itself, I thought like very kind of chilling in a sort of way. Where do those kind of Southern Gothic kind of elements kind of creep in and creep into here? Is that just a part and parcel with just the rural nature, the photography, and the story itself? Does that kind of stuff just kind of like just kind of creep in there on its own? Is that something you kind of try to seek out and put into the film yourself?
I'd say it's twofold because the original story and conception was set in the Southwest and there was more of a Western quality to it. So I'm glad that you saw that. And I wanted to kind of incorporate that as much as I could, even though we kind of reset it to the Midwest, but it was originally conceived as more of a Southwestern story. And then also there's something about, I mean, we shot it in Northern Ontario, but we wanted it to look like Southwestern Ontario, which is where I'm from. And there's something almost kind of called Ontario Gothic that they call here. And it is kind of this version of kind of a Midwestern Gothic. And I think you're kind of, you're responding to that a little bit. But I suspect it was also just because of the original Western conception. I tried as much as I could with the horses and some of the other elements to kind of bring that Western, even with the hats and just certain choices to kind of bring a bit of that in, because that was always part of the original vision.
They say casting is everything. You have a terrific caster. You always cast so well in your movies, and in this film is no exception. I wanted to talk about Stefan James and his role, performance in the movie, which I found to be just fascinating. And he's a protagonist in the film, but he's kind of like unlike any other protagonist we really see from other places as well. And I myself, I have a son who's autistic. I have a sister who deals with a brain injury. So a lot of the things that Stefan does physically in some of the character decisions that he has in the film rings very true to me. There's some of those things like I see those elements in my own life. When it comes to him approaching that story, approaching that character, from what I understand, you kind of let your characters, your actors kind of go, do their thing, and then they come with their kind of interpretation of the character. So when Stefan comes back, he's like, I want to deal with this, I'm thinking of this, thinking of that. What was your first impressions of what Stefan wanted to do, and where do you take it from there? Do you just let him go and do what he needs to do for the role, or do you kind of reconvene with him, have a look at stuff, fixes here, fixes there, and then move forward from there? I'm really curious about that.
Yeah, I mean, the prep process is obviously different with different actors in terms of their approach, but also this was a more extreme case because he's bringing in a certain disability. And so I think, to me, there's a couple things. First off is just that whole process of research and exploration and meeting with others, talking with others. Also, trying to make sure that we're not just replicating what's been seen on film historically, because there's a certain dated approach to representations across the whole spectrum, and not to use that word because that's particularly pertinent here, but across the spectrum of disabilities or lack thereof. And so I think it was important for us. But then it's also, when he first, as we got closer, he was trying out certain things, because it's sometimes hard to know on film what's too much, what's too little, in terms of whether it's physicality, whether it's speech, these different things. And so, the other thing that's a challenge for these roles is consistency, because you've got actors and, Stefan, there was a certain level of methodness that he needed to keep, but he's not like a hardcore method actor. Some actors like a Daniel Day-Lewis or something just would have been like this character for the whole time, all 24 hours a day. And it wouldn't have been a matter of, but Stefan wasn't like that, but it still was quite taxing and tricky. So it was a real challenge. And I think he kind of brought something, and then I would either kind of typically kind of say, look, we can bring it down a little bit, because, the camera just sees so much. And I think once we understand what that is, it's just like, this is maybe a bad example, but when characters are drunk or something on film, or in different states, once you know what that state is, they don't have to play it too hard. And so, but it's kind of a journey and a process, and it's partly what's exhilarating about making these movies, is kind of finding out what they're going to bring. And I've done that in the past with Ethan Hawke, even though he didn't have a specific disability, you kind of turn it over, and then they bring it back, and then it's a matter of trust in terms of balancing. But you never have as much time as you'd like on these indie films to like go into it. And this film was shot at a very, very strange time. It was shot during COVID, quite a few years ago now. So it's taken a little while to come out in Australia, obviously, but it was shot during COVID, as a lot of these films were. And all the actors were in quarantine. Stefan even was, but the others were for 14 days, and so I couldn't even see them. But I would I would Zoom with them. So it was strange time for all of us making a film in those couple of years, and that did affect the prep process, the COVID of it all.
And other characters that are really just interesting to me were the police characters, Marissa Tomei and Paul Walter Hauser. It's kind of the dynamic between the two is really interesting. It's almost kind of like a power play between the two. At one point, one was a lackey to the other, and at another point they're in kind of like equal ground. And there's a kind of like shifting between the two, like who's gonna, outrank the other one, even though technically they can't do that, and how that all kind of works. When it comes to those two characters in particular, do you allow your actors to develop a sort of backstory between the two? Because I know this, because when I watch them, there's a moments in the film where I was like, there's something going on between them that we haven't seen in the 7 years from the start of the film to when we meet up with Lewis's journey again. There's something happened between there. And do you allow your actors to kind of develop their own kind of backstory? And would that kind of explain some of the things that are happening between those two characters? Because I found it very fascinating to watch.
Yeah, I mean, I know for that particular relationship, I spoke to both Marissa and Paul about what I thought their backstory was, partly because, part of the setup, which you do hear about in the movie, is that Marissa's character had kind of like left the one department and moved to a different department, and then Paul's character had kind of moved up. So you get a hint at something, and there's obviously a bit of sexual tension there too, and you're just kind of like, okay, like what's going on? And so we had talked about that, and it's one of the tricks in these kinds of movies is because it's not their movie. I want to keep the POV fairly tight, but at the end of the day, I find these characters and relationships like that really fascinating. So, I wanted to actually delve more and more into it, but there's only so much time you have on these slow burns, especially because people have a certain expectation of pace. It's one of the great things about, the more traditional movies that I based it on to a certain degree is like the audiences, I think, were more accepting of slower paces than they are now. So I personally like kind of slow burns, but going back to their relationship, it was something we talked a lot about, and there was a few other things that we shot with them too that we didn't end up using in the final cut, partly because of for tonal reasons, but there was some more overt sexuality and scenes that we actually shot, which were really fun, and sometimes I still, it's always the case, you shoot some fun stuff and you wonder whether it should be in the film or not, and then you're trying to balance tone, because there's also a bit of comedy. Like Paul is a great comic actor, and so he brings a little subtle comedy when he can to that relationship too. So it was fun.
The Matt's Movie Reviews podcast is brought to you by TeePublic. TeePublic is the world's largest marketplace for independent creators to sell their work on the highest quality merchandise. With over 1.2 million designs, TeePublic is sure to have something you will love. Paul is one of those actors where if he's involved in a film, I'm watching it straight away. I've seen him in so many films over the years. I think the first time he kind of like came to my radar was I, Tonya, and what he did in that film, and ever since then it's just been on a roll, right? What's it like working with him? Because from what I understand, like he's just talking to other filmmakers, he's just been absolute kind of like one of those actors is a like absolute joy to kind of work with. I was just curious about what was your working relationship with him on this film?
Same. I mean, Paul is so easy to work with, such a loving and nice man, and just a great actor. Like he's got that perfect balance of like naturalism, but willing to listen and try stuff, but then try his own stuff. And he's just he's such a joy. And I've obviously stayed in touch, and I'm dying to try to find some other stuff with Paul. And he's been on a real roll lately after winning a bunch of awards and getting into a bunch of films. So I'm hoping I can get to work with him again before too long, because he's great.
Speaking of being on a roll, you yourself a very prolific filmmaker. I know ever since Delias Gone, you already had another film out there with Queen of Bones, and I know you're always working and you've got other things in the pipeline. When you're doing press for like Delias Gone, like so many years after doing the film, and you had the American release a couple of years ago, and now you're doing the Australian release. What's it like now in these final stages of having this movie kind of finally come out into a different territory? For you as a filmmaker, when you finish your films, do you just let it go and you don't, it's got to go do its own thing? Or are you as a filmmaker always kind of like thinking of other things you could do with a film or other things? Because it's interesting how when I talk to different directors, we've been to have release dates that go for a very long time. Sometimes they kind of find it hard to let it go. Sometimes they find it very easy to let go of movies. I'm just curious about yourself.
I think it depends. I mean, once you've started doing enough films, you get used to this idea that there's going to be that gap, and then your mind is often on the next thing, what you're writing, what you're doing. This release has taken a bit more time than even some have, and there's no rhyme or reason with these things. Sometimes it's a matter of COVID did a lot of strange things with release calendars,
Yeah.
and so that was part of it. And then I'm used to films coming out sometimes half a year to a year or so later in different territories. But what it is kind of exciting, because your mind is on the next film, or what I'm writing right now. I'm working on a bunch of things, and then you get a call from someone like yourself saying, "Oh, it's still just kind of going to be new to an Australian audience," and that's really exciting for me, because you kind of push behind that, and I often don't like to look back at stuff too much. You're always wanting to move forward, but it is nice to revisit that and kind of celebrate what you've done, and it reminds you of those things. It also just reminds you that those themes typically, at least I'm a filmmaker that just kind of follows my passions and things. It's usually stuff I've created. It's not so much like I just got hired and it's like a job to do. And so you kind of realize that you're always chasing certain kinds of ideas and themes and tones, and it's fun. Like but it is tricky. I think it's the same with musicians sometimes, when they're even doing concerts, and it's like they put out their record a couple years earlier and they're still trying to get back into it. At least with musicians, they're constantly able to kind of perform their songs over the years, where it's like I'm not performing, or God forbid watching my film, because usually by the time it's come out, I've watched it so many times, I'm sick of it. So, but it's also, you go through that phase where you're so sick of your film and you beat yourself up sometimes over this or that, but then you have a bit of distance and a bit of time, and you're like, oh yeah, it wasn't so bad, and I'm kind of excited about this or that. So it's really nice.
And I got to say, I'm a big fan of what you did here with Delias Gone. I love the performances, the music. Like I said before at the start, I loved doing that deep dive and going to checking out songs I'd never heard of before. And for everyone out there listening, June 5 in Australia, digital and DVD. I really recommend people watch Delias Gone, because to me, it's I love kind of slow burn mysteries. I love rural thrillers as well. Great cast, great music, and just great work here from you, Robin. I thank you so very much for your time today. Congrats with the movie. And yeah, I look forward to talk to you again in the future if we can. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, my pleasure too. Thanks, man.
Thank you for watching the Matt's Movie Reviews channel. Please subscribe for more reviews, podcast interviews, and exclusive content. Also, if you would like to request a review and support my work, please join my Patreon via the link in the description below.